This is a familiar story, isn't it? Before I talk about it, I want to kind of explain why I picked the song I did for you to hear and sing together just before we heard that message from Genesis. The song was called Praise the King, duh, by a songwriter by the name of Cindy Morgan. She wrote it about 20 years ago. 1998, I think, is when the CD that it came on was released. And in order for you to understand my perspective on Moses, I need to tell you about the first time I ever heard that song. And in order to tell you that, you know how Jesus has quotes within quotes? I got stories within stories. In order to tell you that, I need to tell you a little bit about my own heritage. On my father's mother's branch of my family tree, there's a family by the name of McNamee. The McNamees are Scotch-Irish. Fun fact, we thought we were Irish. We found out we were Scotch-Irish only very recently when somebody went back and looked at the rolls in wherever we came from, and my grandmother, no doubt, was rolling over in her grave to find out she was not Irish but Scotch-Irish. Doesn't matter. What happened was this family came over and built a family farm in about 1874, late 19th century. In fact, the original building, this photo is about 100 years old, looks like this. But that's not the building I remember. By the time I came along, it looked like it did in this photo, which was taken, I think, 2 weeks ago, when my family, some of my family were there on vacation. I need to tell you about this, not because I want you all to go there, although I think it would be fun, but because I want you to understand what a holy moment can come from. This house was the house that my father and his brothers and sisters would visit growing up. It's important. They started the farm in the second half of the 19th century. It never really made money. And then the very first generation born in the house decided they didn't want to farm the land anymore. And that's not what they got into, probably because it wasn't making any money and there was a lot of them. So even my grandmother, although she was born in that house, when she got married to George Ham, moved out, and to Williamsport, which is about 20 minutes to the south of this town of Cascade, Pennsylvania. However, the property stayed in the family, as you have already guessed, to this day. It got diluted a little bit. Different cousins and second cousins and third cousins own a piece of this land. We have about 150 acres. It hasn't been a working farm since the early part of the 20th century, and it's completely overgrown with all those trees that you see in the background. When you go to the farm, you are living in the most rustic fashion you can imagine. There's electricity. There's enough for a few lights and a refrigerator. There's no heat. There's no air conditioning. There's no plumbing. There's an outhouse. You bring water in with you. It's like camping out. And it's been that way for a very long time. Now, I grew up one of 8 children, as I've shared before. When you are a family of 2 parents and 8 children, and you go on vacation in the summer, you don't go to Disney World. I never went on a special vacation one single time growing up where it cost my parents a whole lot of money, like I heard about my friends experiencing, and yet I always felt like I was the lucky one because I went there. I went to the farm. We would go there for 2 weeks every year. Sometimes it would just be our family, which when there's 8 kids, that's plenty. Sometimes we'd be spending time camping out there with cousins from my father's side of the family, not my mother's. My mother's side of the family didn't go to this place. They had nothing to do with it, just my father's side. So I spent a lot of time with cousins. I spent a lot of time with aunts and uncles and with my brothers and sisters. And so many of my most precious memories are all tied up in this place. which we still go to when we can today. Fast forward to the year 2000. I'm 36 years old. Now everyone knows how old I am, although I think I've said that before too. So I'm 36 years old, and I go up here, and I'm spending a week. I got a chance to spend a week at the farm. Last time I spent a long time there, I believe, with a couple of my brothers and sisters and some of their kids. And in the middle of this week, and you can't see it, but there used to be 2 trees out front, and there was a hammock strung between them. My brother hands me this CD by Cindy Morgan. He says, "You should listen to this. You'd really like it." I said, okay. This is like really lazy days. So I laid in this hammock, and I took out my little portable CD player. Anybody remember those? I know we listen to music on phones now. We didn't do that then. And I took out my little portable CD player, and I put the CD in, I plugged in headphones, and I just laid there and I listened. And this album, it's called The Loving Kind, is a wonderful song cycle based on the last week of the life of Christ, on the Passion Week. And it covers all of those events. And at the end of covering all those events, she sings this song. Now, you've been on an emotional roller coaster if you've listened, and she sings this song, Praise the King, better than I can. And as I was in that hammock, I wept like a baby. And the reason I did wasn't just because the song is beautiful, but because as I looked around, I could see the tall and lofty trees that she sang about. I could see the children laughing and playing on rolling hills. There was a peaceful porch with rocking chairs that swayed. And I cried like a baby. To this day, when I sing or hear that song, it is hard. I sometimes can't get through it when those memories become so fresh. And what happened was, that became a holy moment on holy ground. Now, I've had a lot of holy moments, and I consider that patch of land in Cascade, Pennsylvania, to be holy ground. But this one was very specific, and it was like God broke through. Now, perhaps you have heard of the concept of something called a thin place. Has anybody ever heard of a thin place? Oh, I'm glad you haven't. A thin place is a place where the boundary between heaven and earth is thin. We don't know exactly who first coined this term, but we think it was probably the Celts centuries ago. And if you can imagine someone walking along in the Highlands of Scotland and just marveling at the beauty of God's creation and realizing that in this place, God seems more present. And that's what a thin place is. Now, thin places can be very different places, and I would also offer events for different people. If we were suddenly whisked up and stood on that lawn right there in Cascade, Pennsylvania right now, most of you would probably say, yeah, what's the deal? There's not even plumbing here. This is not my idea of a good time. Without the history, without the knowledge of the people, and without the heritage that I have based on my experiences there, you might not experience that as a thin place. I also wonder if people have walked in the same space that bush was burning and not known it was that place, if as they walked by, people didn't feel anything. So these thin places are different for different people at different times, and they can be very odd. This place where the boundary between the eternal and the temporal, between God and us, is fuzzy, and it just seems like something's going on. You would not think of a place where people are suffering in pain to be a thin place. But you try telling that to someone in the hospital, a couple who have just experienced the birth of their first child. That is a thin place. On another level in the same hospital, I would argue that there is an equally thin place where a family is gathered around one of their loved ones who is saying goodbye to the life as we know it here. That's not not all thin places are happy. but they still become places where heaven and earth just seem to mingle almost. It's just hard. So, let's get back to Moses. Moses is experiencing a holy moment on holy ground, a thin place like few people ever have in history. He's walking along, and he sees this burning bush. He's even told, this is holy ground, take your shoes off. And every time I read that, I think, are you nuts? It's holy ground. If I take my shoes off, I'm afraid I'm going to just be burned up. I need my shoes to protect myself. But it's holy ground, and it's a holy moment because God has showed up. This leads us to the very first important lesson that I take from holy ground, holy moments. We are so polluted in our minds when we read or hear about Moses that all we can see is Charlton Heston saying, "Let my people go." It's hard to get that image out of your head. And the fact of the matter is, this moment happens well into the film, The Ten Commandments, but if you'll notice, it's only the beginning of chapter 3 of the book of Exodus. So we might know a little bit less about Moses based on the text than we get from the movie. So if you will, forget about the movie if that's possible. So you sit down and you look at chapters 1 and 2 of Egypt, and let's figure out what we know about Moses. Because surely Moses is experiencing a holy moment on holy ground because he's a holy man and he's earned this, right? No. So what happens? Moses is born into a time and place where, according to the law, he is supposed to be put to death. That's the law of the land. The Hebrews have increased in number so much that the Egyptians who are enslaving them and have been enslaving them for 4 centuries basically say to all the midwives, look, when they give birth, if it's a girl, that's cool. If it's a boy, we want it dead. So Moses, first of all, the midwives cheat. They basically ignore that advice. But the family does a little scheming to make sure that Moses is going to be okay. And what they do is they take Moses and they kind of play a trick on the royal family. And Moses ends up getting adopted into the royal family of the Egyptians. And as I'm reading this, I realize, as you read the whole story, I think they knew he was a Hebrew, but somebody just saw this little baby and they were like, oh, the little baby, we can't hurt this baby. What, are you crazy? And he ends up being part of the family. And then at one point, he sees an injustice. He sees an injustice where a man is beating another man, and he responds by becoming a crusader against injustice and only doing the right thing. Right? No. He becomes a murderer. I'm just going to call it what it is. Moses is a murderer. He sees a man beating another man. He kills the man. It is murder. And then he does what all Bible heroes should do. He runs away and hides. He runs off into the desert. He ends up marrying the daughter of a priest of Midian. We know nothing about what kind of priest or anything that he is, but he runs off, marries this daughter of this priest of Midian, and he is a shepherd at this point in the story, hiding out, presumably, for the rest of his life. Bible heroes. Yay. So he's clearly earned a holy moment. Or maybe not. This reminds me of another Bible hero. One of my other favorite holy moments on holy ground. When Saul, the persecutor, and I'm going to say it, the murderer of Christians, is on his way to persecute Christians, and Jesus appears to him on the road. We do not know from the text of Acts that Saul, who becomes Paul, ever actually murdered with his own hands anybody. But we do know for a fact that he stood by, guarded coats, and basically cheered on the stoning of the first Christian martyr. So I'm just going to call him what he is. He is a murderer and a persecutor of the church. Just like Moses was a murderer and a coward, hiding out, not willing to face the consequences of his actions. Bible heroes. So what happens? God appears. I sometimes think when God looks down at us, God looks and says, who is the least likely person for anybody to guess I would pick to do something amazing? Yeah, murdering coward, that'll do. And says that and goes that direction. But then he experiences this holy moment on holy ground, just like Paul does. Whenever I look at these texts, I have to ask myself, why? And there's a whole lot of reasons I do that. The biggest reason I do that is because when I looked at the text for this week, which actually went on longer and talked about the name of God, and we decided not to talk about the name of God today, so we decided to talk about this part. When I look at it, I want to ask myself why, because if I can get at why does God do this, or why does this happen, it might be more interesting than the 27 other sermons that you've heard on Moses that all said variations of the same thing or different things. Somehow I got to take something that you already know about and make it new. So I'm going to ask myself why. Maybe I can get at a why that looks different. Why? Why does God in this case, and why does God sometimes in our own lives give us a holy moment, a holy ground experience? Why? Now, there's a few theories on this. For instance, one of them is kind of the apologetics theory. When you experience something amazing, it gives you some insight that helps you share your faith better in a more convincing fashion. It's like, God has given me this so that I can defend my faith. And I think that is an intentional byproduct, but is not God's reason for holy moments on holy ground. Another one, and I really clung to this for a long time, is the idea that, I remember, for instance, for me, I remember that first moment that my heart was strangely warmed 38 years ago. And I can remember that. And during those times and on those days when it just seems to me like, you know what, I'm just going to give up on this whole following Jesus thing, I can remember that moment, maybe other moments, where I felt that I was in the midst of something holy or in a place that was holy ground, and it will encourage me and keep me on the right path. And I think that is another intentional byproduct, but I am convinced based on what I see from Scripture that is not the reason that God reaches out in these thin places and creates holy moments and places that are holy ground in our lives. There's another reason. And the only way to tell you how I see that other reason is to tell you another story. As most of you know, and maybe all of you remember, I am from a large family. I just mentioned it. I'm one of 8 kids. Half of those 8 kids are in professional ministry. 4 out of the 8. I have a younger brother who is a music minister. I have an older sister who is a pastor in the United Church of Christ. And I have an older brother who is actually a Catholic priest. Whenever I tell people about that, they usually say, what did your parents feed you? And I always like to share, they fed us a steady diet of a real faith that actually worked in the world. That's what they did. So I want to tell you a little bit about my brother John, an experience that he had that I got to be part of. In the Catholic Church, they do deacons and priests different than we in the Methodist Church do deacons and elders. As you may or may not know, in the Methodist Church, in ordained ministry, I'm not ordained, I'm licensed. But in ordained ministry, we have elders and deacons. And some people make the mistake of saying that we have elders and deacons. We don't. We have elders and we have deacons. They're 2 calls to vocational ordained ministry that are equal but different. So we don't ordain people deacons and then they become elders. Whereas in the Catholic faith and in, for instance, in the Anglican communion as well, you become a deacon and then you become a priest. So my brother is part of the Catholic tradition. And as he was going through seminary, there was a day when he was going to be ordained a deacon. But before that, there was a ceremony where all of these men would take a vow to become a deacon. They'd basically make the promises, and then they'd be ordained later. And I was invited to attend this. So I actually went to this event. Myself and my father drove to it. My sister actually met us. And it was a regular evening prayer service that just happened to have this as part of it. When I walked in the building, I could feel it. Now, I know I said that holy ground is different for different people, but I think you and I both know that's not always the case. And I find that especially not always the case with certain church sanctuaries. I walked into what was essentially a chapel on the grounds of a seminary where men, remember the Catholic Church doesn't ordain women, so men would gather for prayer several times a day. And they've been doing this for years and decades. And I'm telling you, I could feel it. I mean, I walked in there and there was a palpable sense in the air that this place was different, that it was a thin place, that even though nothing was happening yet, I was on holy ground. And it was remarkable to me. As we started the service, the first thing that really struck me was, in order to pray along with everyone in this service, you had to have a book that had all the written out prayers. I know most people think because I'm a contemporary music worship guy that kind of thing turns me off. I absolutely adore it. I just love it. It's worse than that. You're reading these words, but you're actually chanting them for the whole service. They're all chanted, sung. First thing that happens is there's two guys who are young priest postulants, or whatever they call them, that notice we don't have the right book. They mark the right pages and hand us their book. The generosity of spirit was so immediate. It reminds me of the way people serve at our community dinner, to be honest with you. It's just a generosity of spirit that is conspicuous. And so my sister and I shared one book. My father had the other one. And we sung along with all these prayers. And it was just a beautiful, one of the top 5 church services I've ever been part of. It was amazing. And then at a certain point, all of the men who are making their vows to become a deacon come forward, and they make their vows, and there's some more prayers and stuff like that. And as I was thinking back on that experience, as I was preparing this sermon, I thought to myself, that's the why. I found the why. I found out why God does this. And it's right there in Scripture, but this spoke to me in volumes. I want you to remember how little Moses deserves his holy moment. I want you to remember how very little Saul deserves to stand on holy ground. The point was total and complete transformation. It was to completely make something new. It was to change something in a way that was going to benefit the world. God was going to do what God does and was going to use murdering cowards. Unbelievable. The whole point of this encounter with Moses, you're standing on holy ground. You are having a holy moment. This is the reason, Moses, you are going to be the one that sets my people free. No wonder Moses spends like the next chapter or so saying, God, you got the wrong guy. No wonder. Anybody who'd just say yes to that would not be the person that God picked in the first place. Paul is similar. Paul spends 3 years preparing before he really enters ministry. I think it's one of the reasons we do seminary for 3 years in most Christian traditions, is that 3 years that Jesus spends, 3 years that Paul spends preparing. It's kind of a model. It's the same thing for us. And this is what I so deeply want us to understand and take with us today, is that Many, if not most of you, have had moments in your life where you felt like it was a holy moment and or you were standing on holy ground. And yes, I hope it benefited your soul. But when God transforms you from someone who lives for themselves into someone who trusts in the one who came to save us from ourselves, the purpose is so that you will set the people free. So that you will be the one who brings the gospel to the world the way that Paul did. We won't get written into Scripture, folks. We might not get books written about us. But our opportunity is to respond to the holy moments on holy ground that God gives us, and maybe even more, to keep our eyes open. Moses could have just walked by. Oh, yeah, oh, look, burning. Look, there's a fire. I'm going to get away from that fire. No, I want to go see what this is about. Paul was a little different. Paul didn't have much of a choice. He was rendered blind. I think Paul was probably more stubborn. God knew that. It's like, you are one stubborn son of a gun, so this is going to take a lot for you, but I'm just going to knock you off your horse. Like I said, holy moments on holy ground, not always comfortable. But may we be open to knowing that God intends them to transform us so that we can do something that no one else can do.